Hi, I'm Chris, a senior at Harvard, and today Professor Peterson is going to be talking about voting and presidential elections. Three parts to this lecture. Part 1, voting and political participation. Part 2, the primary contest. And Part 3, the general election. We're going to start with Part 1. Who could vote in America at the time of the Revolution, and how has suffrage expanded since?
Well, at the time of the Revolution, only male voters were allowed. You had to be 21, and you had to have property. So it was hardly the democratic system that we have today. And we've seen, through amendments to the Constitution, a gradual expansion of the electorate as defined by the Constitution. First African Americans, then women, then people who live in the District of Columbia who are now allowed to vote in presidential elections, then 18-year-olds, someday perhaps felons. Will children be allowed to vote? Some people think they should be. Anyhow, that's a progression that we have observed over time. But not everybody votes.
Why is that?
Well, it's the old free rider problem again. It costs time and money to vote. You got to take time off work sometimes. You might lose wages. You might have to hire a babysitter. There's long lines at the polls sometimes. It can be uncomfortable waiting in line. It could be bad weather. That always puts the vote down. And in any case, it's going to take some of your time, even if these costs are minimal. And the benefits are pretty ephemeral. Your vote hardly matters. There's a very, very few elections that are decided by one vote. And if they are decided by one vote, then there's a big legal hassle, and maybe your vote won't count after all. So material rewards are no longer available for voting. Now, I remember when I worked in a political campaign in Chicago, the machine politician on the other side was handing out bottles of booze right across the street from the way where the vote was being taken. I was standing there watching it, missing the action completely. What would happen is he stole a ballot. They were paper ballots in those days. He stole a paper ballot out of the voting booth early in the morning before I got there, brought it across the street, and as people came to the apartment, then he would hand them a filled out ballot, and they had to bring back a clean ballot. So if they brought back a clean ballot, they got a bottle of booze. Well, that was Chicago. That was the way it was, and that was the way it was in many cities. So those things don't exist much anymore. There's still psychological benefits. You can still feel, hey, it's great, I voted today. But how powerful is that? It works for some people, but a lot of people don't vote.
How does voter turnout in the U.S. compare with that in other democracies?
Well, actually, we get somewhere between 50 and 60% of the population voting, and that's not too different than in Switzerland. But most other countries, you have turnouts that range up to 70, 80, and 90%. So we are a low turnout country compared to other major industrial democracies.
Why is turnout in the U.S. lower in these other democracies?
Well, the reason it's lower in the United States is in part because of our political system, our rules and regulations. We have registration requirements. You have to register before Election Day. We used to have poll taxes and literacy tests. Now it's gotten a lot easier. It used to be the case that you had to live in the state for quite a while before you could vote. Now that's been reduced substantially. Some countries like Australia have compulsory voting. And they also impose penalties on people for not voting. So there's a lot of formal legal requirements in the United States that tend to reduce voting. Party mobilization is greater in other countries because they have stronger political parties. People are actually members of parties. And the parties are, because they are stronger, they can mobilize the vote more effectively. Because of the decline of political parties in the United States, and nobody really identifies as a strict member of a party, they just have a party ID, the party mobilization is less effective in the United States. And then there are other factors too. We have so many elections. We have primary elections, we have state and local elections, we have school board elections. We're going to have a mayoral election in Boston in November. So there's a lot of factors that reduce the vote in the United States.
How has turnout changed over time within the United States, and why?
Well, turnout has actually gone down since the 1960s with a recent revival. In that revival continued to 2012, which is about at the same level as in 2008, to what much to many people's surprise. People thought that it would drift downward. And we'll return to that topic a little bit more in a bit. But the reason for the decline over the period between the 40s and the 50s is the decline in the political parties, as we've talked about previously. And the reason for the revival of the vote is that we now have these nationalized party machines that are using social networking techniques to mobilize the voters back into the political process once again.
Does turnout vary across social and economic groups in the United States?
It does, and sometimes it's surprising exactly the way it does vary. You can see that people who are over the age of 65 but not over the age of 75 are the group that is most likely to vote, and the people who are ages 18 to 24 who are still in college or new members of the workforce, don't have families yet, are sort of unattached from society, they're the least likely to vote. They're also the most mobile people, so they're moving around the country. They haven't registered yet. The registration law probably suppresses the young people's vote more than any other segment of the population. So the older you become, the more you vote until you reach the age of 75, and then there's a downward shift again. And of course, higher income people vote more than lower income people. People who are better educated vote more than those who are less educated. With respect to men and women, it's changed. It used to be that men were much more likely to vote than women. That was the way it was even after the women got the right to vote back in the 1920s, but it took a long time before women got fully mobilized, and now today they're more likely to vote than men. And Hispanics are the least likely to vote because so many of them are worried that they're being considered illegal, even if they're not illegal, and because they are a low-income population and less educated and less attached to the communities in which they reside. And I suppose the biggest surprise in this slide is the fact that in 2012, the black voters turned out at a higher rate than the white voters. That's an Obama effect, undoubtedly, in part, but it's also a social networking effect, that the social networking movement targeted the black community and did a good job of mobilizing that population. And one of the reasons why Obama did particularly well is that he did a better job of mobilizing his constituency in 2012 than many people thought he was going to be able to do.
So is low turnout a problem?
Well, some people think it's not, that a high turnout's not necessarily a good thing. If you have unstable situation in a society, you're probably going to have large turnouts. Sometimes you see these countries that are in great political crises, they have incredible turnouts in their elections. There's an example from Iraq. And some people think that only people who care should vote. That's sort of an elitist argument, that it's a good thing that the people who don't care much about politics don't vote because they wouldn't really know who to vote for anyhow. Other people say, well, yes, voters are unrepresentative of the population as a whole, and therefore the outcome is different than it would be if it were a true democracy and everybody voted. And what's more, good citizenship makes for good citizens. If you are a voter, you will be a supporter of your society in other ways as well. It helps to stabilize democracy to have the people engaged in the political process. So is low turnout a problem? That's widely debated. Probably the level of turnout that we currently have, around 60%, is one that is likely to sustain a stable democracy. We don't have to worry about this problem excessively. But both sides of the political spectrum are going to try to mobilize their voters. So each side is going to feel like they need to do more to mobilize their constituents. So we're going to hear a lot about low turnout being a problem in the media by the political parties because each side wants to do the most they can to get their people out to vote. Well, here's the case for voting from the Late Late Show. I'll let you hear that argument as well.
Here's the thing that made me think that, though. The people who didn't register to vote, when they were asked why they didn't vote, they said, half of them said, I'm not interested in the election, and the other half said, I'm not interested in politics. How could you be not interested in politics if you've got to have an opinion about something? Don't you think? I mean, I don't know. I'm not interested in politics. Do you live anywhere? Do you shop anywhere? Do you drive a car? Do you put on pants? Do you leave the house at any point? Do you own the house? Do you rent the house? Do you ever hope that the police will save you from something that may or may not be illegal? Of course you're involved in politics. If you're alive, you're involved in politics. I'm just saying. Anyway, I thought I would bring out... No, please.